Well, I'm thrilled to have Molly here with us. She is an incredible reporter and author, and what we thought we would do in setting up this program is to have somebody kind of tee up where we are in Washington. And so what I did is I was in touch with the White House and I said, could you take down an Iranian general so we have something really to talk about? I asked Nancy Pelosi about impeachment, so we're at that stage. So I think we have a perfect segue into where we are in Washington. But the topic of this is, where are we today? How are we starting out a brand new year? So really to take your questions, which we will in just a minute, but Molly, we really have a collision course in terms of impeachment and a national security crisis.
Yeah, absolutely, and they wouldn't seem to have much to do with each other, although I guess there are some conspiracy theories that say that they do, but it is, the whole last 3 years have felt like just this constant stream of news, and Washington's sort of on fire all the time. But this is really an incredible way to start the new year with the impeachment sort of hanging in the balance. Nobody knows where it's going to go. I don't know where it's going to go. And at the same time, this foreign policy crisis, I think a lot of foreign policy observers have been saying since Trump took office that he was bound to be tested in some way, that the international community that he has been so proud to sort of thumb his nose at in a lot of ways, that eventually that was going to come to a head in some way. So I don't know where that's going either. But what's happening this week, what's happening tomorrow, in fact, is that the Congress is coming back, and they will, the Democrats in the House are planning to introduce a war resolution to try to limit the president's options for military action. And so there's going to be a lot of debate in Congress about what to do with the situation in the Middle East, even as they continue to be in this standoff over impeachment.
So how many of you trust that the president is telling the truth about Iran, that you believe what he was saying? Anyone? Raise your hands if you trust the president. That's incredible, just a handful of hands. So, Molly, let's take this in terms of history, because if you look at Vietnam, you look at Watergate, you look more recently at the Afghanistan papers and the reporting of the Washington Post, you look at the war in Iraq, and you look at, let's be honest, the lies that Donald Trump has told over his 3 years. There has been an incredible amount of distrust towards the government. It didn't begin with Donald Trump, but we're seeing a lot of that right now with regard to killing this general, which, by the way, is the first time since World War II that we've taken out a government official. We've taken out bin Laden. He was a stateless character, and Abu Bakr, but this is the first time we've taken out a government official in more than 70 years.
And I think that's a very good way to put it in perspective. Look, politicians, like journalists, need credibility. And as a journalist, a lot of what we do is to build our credibility with our readers every day. This is obviously not an exact analogy, but the point is, you earn people's trust. And politicians have to do that too, by telling the truth, by appearing to try to tell the truth, by appearing to care about the truth. And so, but I think you make a good point that this is not an issue unique to Trump, and I think the Iraq War in particular, for a lot of journalists of my generation and policymakers of this sort of generation, they look back on that as an instance of rushing to war based on too much trust in the government and the administration and in the supposedly secret intelligence that they were selling to the Congress. And so I think that looms very large in the back of a lot of people's minds to say, it's not that we shouldn't trust because we are opposed to the president or anything else, but just because there is a track record of administrations relying on dubious claims to go into foreign policy adventures that didn't turn out very well, right? Despite the mission accomplished banner a few months into the Iraq War, we've still got troops there, and we're still in Afghanistan, and so I think there is an absolutely higher level of wariness now about that kind of thing.
And think about what happened yesterday in the Iraqi parliament, a resolution. It doesn't mean that we're going to pull out 5,000 U.S. troops, but a resolution to withdraw American troops after spending close to $2 trillion and thousands of American lives in Iraq. So we really are at a tipping point. And one of the editorials I saw over the weekend, I think, really kind of framed the question. It was from the New York Times. Not whether the killing of the Iranian general was justified, but whether it was wise. How do you respond to that?
I think that's the right question, right? And I think that's the question that a lot of people are asking. I am not much of a foreign policy expert. It's really not my area. I focus on domestic politics. But I think that is the way that you're seeing a lot of people frame this question because, very few people would argue that the Iranians in general, that this general in particular was not a malign actor. That's not the point. The point is, have we thought through the consequences? Have we figured out, is there a plan? And not just are you telling us there's a plan, but can you show us there's a plan? Can you prove that that this has been considered in a way that isn't going to cause, a chain reaction that ultimately isn't worth it?
And this is not a plug because I work at C-SPAN, but it is a great resource if you're doing any research, the video library. So if you go to the video library and type in Congressman Lindsey Graham, in 1998 and 1999, early 99, he is demanding that the Senate have witnesses in a Senate trial in the impeachment of President Bill Clinton. And among the witnesses that he wants is Monica Lewinsky. And he's very vocal about the need to have witnesses in a Senate trial, otherwise he's calling it a sham. And you have the House then Senator Chuck Schumer saying that the Republicans are trying to overturn the will of the people. Sound familiar? And so my question to you is, it's hypocrisy on both sides because now it's completely the opposite. Lindsey Graham wants to shut down any Senate trial, and Chuck Schumer is demanding witnesses on a Senate trial.
That's right. And this is one of those issues that tends to make a hypocrite out of everybody, right? There's a lot of Democrats back then saying, well, you shouldn't ever have an impeachment that goes along party lines because that's divisive to the country. And a lot of Republicans, as you said, saying, well, any violation by the president requires this type of response, et cetera, et cetera. And they both think that they are not being hypocrites. They all believe that there are substantive differences between that impeachment and this one. And I've spoken at length with Speaker Pelosi, who is the subject of my forthcoming book, which everyone should pre-order now and buy in May. But I've spoken at length with her about what she sees as the difference between those impeachments. And she calls the impeachment of President Clinton a joke. She believes that it was merely partisanship. She believes that the Republicans never saw Clinton as a legitimate president, in part because they thought he was low class, and that they were determined to get him from the beginning. And that, there's a lot of parallels between that and what you hear a lot of Republicans saying now, that this really has arisen only out of the animus that Democrats felt against President Trump from day one. The Democrats look at this, they say, no, there's substance here. There's a substantive case. There's an important national security issue. The 2020 election is at risk if we do nothing. That's why we had to move forward. The facts of the case are largely undisputed. But in terms of the process, you hear a lot of the same arguments being made now by the Republicans that the Democrats made 20 years ago. And so a similar partisan stalemate unfolding. It'll be interesting to see if it has similar consequences, right? The biggest difference, though, is that this is the first impeachment in history of a president in his first term who's seeking re-election. Andrew Johnson sought but did not win the nomination of his party after his impeachment and non-conviction in the 1890s. But this is the first time that a president almost certainly is going to be on the ballot after having been impeached. So that's a big difference with President Clinton, because people still debate the political fallout of the impeachment. The House voted to open impeachment right before the 1998 midterm elections, and then voted to impeach right after. It was the vote to impeach President Clinton was the last one Newt Gingrich ever cast as a member of Congress, and then the Senate trial was after that. And Clinton's approval rating was very high as he left office. The Democrats did better than you might expect for a midterm election in '98. So there's sort of a conventional wisdom that it ended up helping rather than hurting Clinton, and that's what you see Trump and a lot of Republicans arguing now, which is a very strange situation sort of constitutionally, right? This is what the founders intended to be the ultimate sanction, the sort of break glass in case of emergency in the Constitution. And there is a fear on the part of a lot of scholars, analysts, politicians themselves that the whole process has become trivialized, become a political football, become just something that the parties use against each other, and I don't know how you get out of that situation.
And consider this, 4 of the last 5 presidents have been reelected. So if the past is prologue, Donald Trump will be reelected in 2020. I'm going to put this down for, the title of the book, by the way, is?
Pelosi.
Okay, so I'm going to put this down for a minute.
What was this about? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Well, and a big.
You did it better than I did. Go and stand up. You did it better. Stand up. You did it better than I did. Come on. Give us the Pelosi class. Come on. Very good.
She makes this face too. She's
Yeah, but the face is a little bit more, right, sort of
Forward
sardonic
mother.
looking. Well, so this was during the State of the Union a little over a year ago today, or a little less than a year ago today, right, early February. And this was after she became Speaker for the second time with the government shut down and proceeded to stubbornly wait out Donald Trump until he caved to allow the government to reopen. She postponed the State of the Union because the way the State of the Union works, the House actually invites the president to come and give this address. And long ago, most presidents actually just would submit something in writing. But there's been this tradition of giving a speech to the Congress. And one of the things that I think is interesting about Speaker Pelosi is because of her long experience and because of her mastery of the processes and procedures of the House, she's able to sort of pull these levers of power that most other people don't know exist, right? I don't think it would have occurred to a less experienced politician that you could do this. You could take this invitation you'd issued to the president and say, with the pretext of, oh, you know, the government shut down, we can't guarantee the security, that was what she said, but it obviously served to sort of needle Trump. So by the time the State of the Union happens, and the Democratic women are all wearing white in honor of women's suffrage, the 100th anniversary last year, and there's a line in Trump's speech where he says, let's have, you know, more unity and less discord. And so it seemed like she was really sort of highlighting the irony of that statement to a lot of people, that this was a sort of sardonic, and I think someone on Twitter even said she had invented the FU clap. But she claimed, and she often sort of does this, she claimed, oh no, I was completely in earnest. I was applauding what he was saying. I agree with him. I think we should have more unity. And so that she sort of had deniability to claim that she wasn't in any way mocking him or trying to make him look bad. She just earnestly was applauding his statement.
And she prays for him every day, she says.
That's right. Praise the president, she says. And she is a quite devout Catholic. I believe she does pray every day. And so I take her at her word that she prays for the president.
So another historical context, the 3 of the key people involved in the impeachment of President Clinton. Now remember that the whole impeachment was under the auspices that he lied under oath. But the premise of it was that he had a consensual, albeit wrong, morally wrong, relationship with an intern who was the same age as his daughter Chelsea. So let's put the outset that it was wrong, but it was consensual, based on both accounts. But then you had Speaker Gingrich forced out in part because he was having an affair with his now 3rd wife. And then you had Bob Livingston of Illinois, who resigned on the House floor, admitting that he was having a sexual relationship outside of his marriage. And then you had Denny Hastert, who became the Speaker of the House, and subsequently, after leaving office, was sent to jail because he was paying off young men after having relationships with them as a wrestling coach. And so again, the hypocrisy, again, what Bill Clinton did was wrong, but you have these 3 Republicans who were key in the Clinton impeachment, all dealing with a similar situation.
Yeah.
I'm trying to keep this clean.
A lot to unpack there. You know, I think a lot about the relationship between politicians' personal behavior and their fitness for office, right? I think this is a sort of ongoing debate in American politics, because for as long as there have been elected officials, there have been sex scandals, and in general what you find is that voters tend to separate the two. Now, partisanship plays a role. In the 90s, it was Republicans who strongly believed that, a politician who has dubious morals in his personal life can't possibly serve the nation with character. Now it's more the Democrats who say that kind of thing, that a politician's character is super important, and you have the Republicans saying, no, what all that matters is results, don't pay any attention to the personal life of President Trump and all those allegations. But I think it is really an open question, and in a democracy it is up to the voters to decide whether they care about that kind of thing. But you go back in history, and the level of transparency we bring to these things has changed a lot, right? You didn't see very much reporting contemporaneously on the many, many dalliances of President Johnson or President Kennedy. And you sometimes hear some nostalgia for that, that, if only we weren't poking around in these people's personal lives, they could, do whatever they had to do to go about the business of the nation. That's not a view that I think is particularly respectful to the other parties involved in these situations. I just as a reporter think more transparency is almost always good. But it's I think particularly in the age of social media and basically constant surveillance by cell phones and cameras and whatever else, there's sort of a reckoning coming as a nation with how we figure out how to weigh these questions and what standards of behavior we demand from politicians in this new age where we know everything.
Which leads us to 2020. We have a record number of Democrats. Some have just dropped out. Julian Castro today endorsing Elizabeth Warren. We've had Pete Buttigieg rise and then fall a little bit. Elizabeth Warren rise and then fall. Joe Biden seems to be pretty consistent as the front runner despite all the incoming at him. So just give us an overall sense. We're about a month out to the Iowa caucuses, the New Hampshire primary, then South Carolina and Nevada, and then Super Tuesday in early March. Some thinking that this is going to go all the way to the convention in Milwaukee. Some thinking if one of the candidates is able to win 2 or 3 states in February, it negates Michael Bloomberg's so far $300 million campaign spending. Keep in mind that Barack Obama spent $300 million during the entire general election of 2008. So we're seeing unprecedented amounts of money. Just give us an overall sense of how you view this race on the Democratic side.
So many things about this race are unprecedented, and I think that's important to keep in mind because we do tend to look to history for some kind of guidance, for some kind of analogy to try to help us understand how it's going to go. But we're in a very different environment than we've been in before. There's never been a field this large. Even with the many candidates who have dropped out, it's still larger than I believe than any Democratic field in history, and I think it's still larger than the Republican field in 2016, which at that time was the largest field of major candidates in history. And you've got online fundraising and other avenues available to the candidates that allow them to keep going for a lot longer. It used to be you could raise a certain, not very large amount of money, and then when the money ran out, you had to stop your campaign. But you look at, Bernie Sanders in 2016, for example, because he has this devoted online fan base, long after he was not viable in terms of the delegate count, he was able to stay in the race and continue speaking for the issues that he was passionate about with the platform that he had. And so that really changes the equation for a lot of these candidates too. So, and then you have a race that's very, very unsettled, no front runner in the traditional sense. Biden is the front runner in the sense that he's consistently been on top of the national polls, not necessarily the early state polls. But the Democratic establishment hasn't necessarily rallied around him in the way that they would a sort of presumptive front runner like George W. Bush in 2000 or Hillary Clinton in 2016. And particularly, and then nobody knows what role the early states are going to play, right? There's a sense that Iowa and New Hampshire in particular may not play their traditional sort of winnowing role for the field because the campaign is so nationalized, because there are so many candidates pursuing different strategies, because of the different demographics of some of the early states and the changes to the calendar, the front-loaded Super Tuesday in different ways than the past. This is a very long and well-informed way of saying I have no freaking clue what's going to happen or who's going to win. I do think, Bernie Sanders, there's a few new polls out showing him on top of both Iowa and New Hampshire, and I don't know that, the rest of the field or the sort of Democratic establishment, for lack of a better word, has really internalize the possibility that he could well win this thing, he's got a very good chance. But so do several others. So it's going to be fascinating to see. When I go out to the early states, particularly in Iowa, where these caucus goers have been through so many of these cycles, they're so well informed, they scrutinize the candidates so intensely, and yet a lot of them still haven't necessarily picked. And in polls you have 50, 60, 70% of Iowa caucus goers saying they could still change their mind, and it's almost 2016, particularly among the Republicans, I would hear a lot of people say, well, I just don't like any of these candidates. It's sort of the opposite. What I'm hearing from Democrats now, they're saying, actually, I do like all these candidates. I kind of wish someone else would decide, because Democratic voters, more than anything, want to get to the general election and take on Donald Trump. And they don't particularly care who that candidate is. They have preferences, but what I hear a lot is a lot of impatience and this sort of like, yeah, I know it's my decision to make, but I kind of wish someone else would do it so we could just get on with things. And so that, I think, has contributed to this weird stalemate.
We did an interview, we sat down with Trump, which was bizarre in and of itself, but just sitting down with the president. But he said, bring on Elizabeth Warren, bring on Bernie Sanders, because if I'm running against what he would call socialists, and we have a strong economy, he said, I think I can win 30, 35 states. And he may not be that far off, because we're not a socialist country. We're a center-left, center-right country.
Well, it's interesting. You do see a lot more receptiveness to the socialist label, particularly among the younger generation now than at any point in the last several decades. And so it is a label, I think, that has lost some of its stigma. But Elizabeth Warren doesn't call herself a socialist, although she is further to the left than a lot of the other candidates on policy. Donald Trump
started pushing back on Medicare for all.
Donald Trump is not a political scientist and has won one election in his life. I'm not taking anything away from that accomplishment on his part. But there are a lot of other electoral analysts I might listen to first. That being said, he's not wrong that there's a pretty robust body of evidence that candidates who are viewed as extreme are less, the voters, particularly independent voters, are less friendly to those kinds of candidates than candidates who are perceived as moderate. So there is a worry on the part of a lot of Democrats that they don't want to choose a candidate who's viewed as far to the left, out of step with sort of the mainstream of American voters.
We'll talk about you in just a moment. I'm going to walk around the room. There's no right or wrong answer, but in a word or phrase, the state of American politics today is what? So I'm going to begin with you. What's your name?
Drew,
Where do you go to school?
Keene State College in Keene, New Hampshire.
Oh, wow. First in the nation primary. So the state of American politics today is?
Ooh. Troubling.
Troubling. Okay, I'm going to come right over here to you, sir. The state of American politics. What's your name? Where do you go to school?
My name is Ben, and I go to Columbia University.
Great polling school. So the state of politics today is?
Polarized.
Polarized. So we go all the way back here. What's your name, sir?
Alexander,
Where do you go to school?
University of San Diego.
I love my dream job is to be a weather forecaster in San Diego. You can take it on Monday and be out for the rest of the week. The state of American politics today is what?
Chaotic.
What's your name?
Nicole.
State of politics today is?
Divided.
Divided, polarized, chaotic. You go all the way back here. How's that coffee? What's your name?
Jeffrey.
Where do you go to school?
Quinnipiac.
The state of American politics is?
Crazy.
Crazy, okay. I'm going to come over here. All the way. What's your name?
Sylvia,
Where do you go to school?
Seton Hall University.
State of American politics is?
Hyperpartisanship.
Hyperpartisanship. And all the way back here, one more. Let me get somebody back here. I feel like Phil Donahue. State of American politics today is what?
Complicated.
Where do you go to school? What's your name?
Miami-Dade Honors College, Lewis Martin.
So, anyone else want to weigh in? State of American politics is what?
I can't think of any more words. They keep picking all the ones I go.
Which one did you choose?
Chaotic.
Chaotic. So, Molly, what are you hearing?
A remarkable level of consensus and an assessment I definitely don't disagree with. It feels like and I've been covering politics politics for about 15 years now, and this is more chaotic than I've ever seen it, and more polarized as well. So congratulations, you're all correct, and you all have a bright future in political analysis.
How much does Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Rachel Maddow, partisan cable TV play in all of this today that we didn't have really in the 1990s with the Clinton impeachment, and certainly didn't have in the 1970s with Richard Nixon?
Well, Rush was around in the 90s, and right-wing talk radio was definitely already a thing in the 90s. But I think it's probably overestimated the effect that voices like that have, at any given time. And I'm on cable news. I'd love to think that everybody was riveted by our every word, but the sliver of Americans who actually watch cable news is pretty small. So yeah, people are getting their opinions, getting their cues, but I tend to think that that the partisan voices in media are more an effect than a cause of the polarization. That the reason they're popular and have a receptive audience is that people are hungry for that kind of red meat, right? That sort of almost tribalistic reassurance that everything that comes out of your side is good and everything that comes out of the other side is bad. There's a sort of deep-seated human desire for that kind of thing, and so of course somebody's going to fill the opening in the market.
So let's get to your questions. Line up. Before we get to their questions, your journey to Washington, D.C. and Time Magazine, how did you end up where you are today?
Boy, a series of great coincidences, basically. I moved around a lot as a kid, but I'm mostly from Denver, Colorado. Worked on my high school newspaper, my college newspaper, started interning for print newspapers. The first one was in Toledo, Ohio, and found that I really liked it and didn't know how to do anything else. But after I graduated and interned at the Washington Post and thought I was set for life, it turned out there was no job available for me. So I moved to Asia. I was a reporter in Cambodia for 2 years for the late lamented Cambodia Daily. And then I was a local newspaper reporter in Las Vegas for 6 years, which is one of the best jobs in journalism because it is just such a great news town. If you can't find a story in Vegas, you are not trying. And that's where I started covering politics. But the other thing I point out is I'm not necessarily a political junkie. I was a general assignment reporter at the beginning of my career. I just like to tell great stories. And so when the job covering politics came open, I jumped at it, and I like it, and I think politics is fascinating. But at heart, I consider myself a generalist. And what I really like about politics is you're basically covering everything. You're covering every issue. You're covering every aspect of American society and American life. It's culture, it's policy of all different kinds, it's demographics, it's change, and of course, it's government, which nothing is more important in democracy than the reporters who give people insight into their government. So anyway, at the same time, local newspapers, as you might know, are dying, and there's not a lot of upward mobility in that old sort of path that I pursued, where you do newspaper internships and then you work for larger and larger newspapers. So I actually moved to D.C. With my husband, 2 unemployed journalists, an infant, and a small amount of savings, and just sort of did some freelancing to try to get noticed, and ended up working at Politico and then at The Atlantic, and then for the last couple of years I've been at Time. So, but my background is in local political journalism, and I think that that's been really valuable to me because I've covered state legislature campaigns, I've covered voter registration drives in 110-degree heat in parking lots in Las Vegas. And that's where you really see the sort of rubber meet the road politically, right? That micro level interaction of people running for office, politicians and their constituents, and I think that's really important to understanding politics.
We'll get to your questions if you line up to the microphones. I would agree that I learned more covering city council and school boards. It never is so much fought over so little, and you can translate that into what we're doing and seeing today. So, Molly, thanks for being with us. Let's get to your questions. First up, please keep them brief. We only have about 10-15 minutes. Your first name, where you go to school, and then the question.
My name's Casey. I go to Suffolk University in Boston, and my question is, as you said, today we have more access to information than ever, but with this comes fake news, biases, stuff like that in the media, and there seems to be a distrust between the media and the public. How do you think that this distrust will impact the upcoming election, and what can we as consumers do to hold the media accountable for transparency?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think about this all the time. I don't have an answer. I would like someone smarter than me whose job it is to fix it, frankly. It's all I can do to do my job. I do think that for reporters, the most important thing for us is to keep doing our jobs with integrity, right? Because I think there are a lot of people who would like to see us take up the fight against Trump, right? Because he's waged war on the media, so the media should take up arms against him. I think that is not what we should do. I think we ought to continue to keep as our lodestar the truth, not one side or the other, and try to follow the facts where they lead no matter what. Now, that doesn't solve the problem, right? That doesn't solve the problem because people don't know what to trust. People don't know which information they can trust or not. If it's in Time Magazine, you can trust it. That's my number one rule. But seriously, we have a very rigorous process. We have fact-checking, and we make mistakes. Journalism's the first draft of history. Everybody's going to make mistakes, but the important thing is we correct our mistakes. When they're brought to our attention, we welcome that information. We are happy to have somebody tell us, hey, anything from, you spelled this name wrong, or that event you described didn't happen that way, or whatever else. We want to get it right. That is the number one thing we are trying to do. We're not activists for one side or the other. And so I think there's a lot going on in terms of, should there be more regulation of tech? Should there be other ways? Because if you think about it, before the advent of the internet, there was always some kind of gatekeeper between the readers and the information. There was always some, hopefully, responsible actor. And it's a double-sided coin, right? Because those same gatekeepers also suppressed a lot of important voices. They also prevented a lot of people, particularly in marginalized communities, from being part of the conversation. So there's a lot that's good about everybody having access to an audience. There's a lot that's bad about it, too. And so there's an ongoing policy discussion about this. I'm not going to be the one to figure out how to solve it. But I'm glad that people are thinking about it. I'm glad that, as much as, it's no fun to have people yell fake news in your face, it's good that people are skeptical of the media. People should always be skeptical of any information they receive. And I hope that what your educations are doing is equipping you with the tools to read carefully and critically, evaluate things like, the sourcing of an article or the place that it comes from, so that you can responsibly evaluate, what's believable and what isn't. Thank you.
And you're going to hear a lot this week from a lot of different people, but let me just add one final quick point. No credible news organization wakes up every morning. Molly Ball doesn't get up in the morning and say, how can I push fake news out there? And there is fake news out there. There's opinion journalism out there. But every credible news organization, Time, Newsweek, New York Times, Washington Post, they all have their reputation. And so there's no intent to put fake stories out there. Yes, we are the first draft of history. Yes, we often get it wrong. But it's never intentional, and we always correct it because our reputation is on the line. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Just going off of, my first thought, my name is George Mosier, Quinnipiac University. If 2016 is any indication, being in the media is a very effective way of advertising yourself as a candidate one way or another. What advice would you give to candidates such as Andrew Yang or Mike Bloomberg or Tom Steyer that have been very much on the outside looking in, and how they could potentially get back in the race?
Come on, C-SPAN more often, don't
No, that's kind of a version of my answer. So, Bloomberg and Steyer are in a different category because they can buy all the airtime they need, right? But yes, a lot was made of, Trump getting so much airtime in 2016. I do not agree with the analysis that says that it was all free advertising. A lot of it was negative coverage of outrageous statements he made and so on. And he ended up, by the time of the election, being the most unpopular nominee in the history of opinion polling. So it's not the case that, he just got free campaign commercials the whole time. But the point being, I think candidates should make themselves accessible. I think they should be available to the media. I think that by extension that makes them available to their potential constituents. People want to see a leader who can answer questions, a leader who isn't afraid to put themselves out there, who isn't so hemmed in by their consultants that they're just sort of, a puppet be reading a script. I think people really want to feel like they know these candidates, and it is a very pernicious trend in my book of candidates walling themselves off from the media, not doing White House press briefings, not doing press conferences, not doing interviews, not participating in profiles in Time Magazine. I think the number one thing candidates can do to build awareness, and you look at someone like Pete Buttigieg, a lot has been made of how he sort of, nobody knew who he was before this campaign. And what did he do to get himself on people's radar? He agreed to every, 2-bit podcast and fishing special interest magazine and every opportunity that he had to reach voters and be honest with them. And he's done the sort of John McCain-style bus tour where he takes any and every question. Now, just because you're accessible doesn't guarantee you're going to win, right? If you're an Andrew Yang, who has, I think, been quite accessible, it may be the case that that not enough people think you're the right candidate. Fine. But I definitely, and this is self-interested, obviously, on the part of the media, we want access to these candidates, but I do think it's good for candidates to be as accessible as they can so that voters can feel like they know them.
Next question, thanks.
Hi, my name is Drew Cole. I am from Keene State College in New Hampshire. You guys, I think you talked a little bit about this briefly at the beginning. As I'm sure you know, there was a whole wagging the dog situation with Bill Clinton and his impeachment trial. So I was wondering if, in your opinion, do you think this assassination of the general and Trump's impeachment is another wagging the dog type situation?
It's interesting how history repeats itself.
It is. I don't know. And so I think all we can do is try to find the facts. Because of the history, it is a potentially justifiable suspicion, but I don't think we should jump to conclusions without facts. And a lot of the reporting sort of goes to both sides, right? We know that there are a lot of Iran hawks in this administration, and that this is part of a strategy to counter Iran. That a lot of that the Secretary of State himself had been pushing for a very aggressive stand against Iran. And that a lot of others, the former National Security Advisor John Bolton praised this action, thought it was very important to take a tough line against Iran. We also know that the president is obsessed with politics and doesn't pay all that much attention to the nitty-gritty of briefing books and policy and so on. He tends to go on his gut, and a lot of people like that, and a lot of people don't. So I don't think it's possible that the two things weren't commingled in his mind to some degree. But can we ever know, given the credibility of the players involved, whether, what really happened, what the motivation really was? Maybe not, but I think all we can do is look for further reporting, try to get more facts.
Thank you.
We'll stay on this side. Go ahead. You're next.
Along the same line as her question, do you believe that the situation with Iran right now is used by Trump to deter the focus from the impeachment while subsequently aiming to gain support from the people by making Iran seem as a common enemy? And my name is Yasmin Sadiv and I go to Suffolk University. Sorry.
Thank you for the question.
Thanks for your question. I am not an opinion writer, and so I don't have an opinion about that. It's interesting. I mean, looking at the president's tweets, he's still tweeting about impeachment as much as he's tweeting about Iran. So he hasn't taken this as a way to stop talking about impeachment. At the same time, you do see him making the case that now that we have this crisis on our hands, the impeachment becomes all the more, to his mind, irrelevant and absurd and a distraction. So I don't have an opinion one way or the other.
But here's a spoiler alert. Donald Trump will not be removed from office. So you can go to the bank on that. You go to Vegas and bet on that. But I would say this. Yesterday I saw a tweet from Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader. And his tweet was, the Democrats want to get Donald Trump out of the White House. Donald Trump wants to get terrorists out of the country. So that's how they're framing the debate on the Republican side. Yes, go ahead. Thank you for waiting.
Hi, I'm Kelly from University of Pikeville. And
Do you know Nancy? By the way, Nancy, 25 years of doing the Washington. How about a round of applause? She's been doing it since before you were all born. And she just celebrated her 30th wedding anniversary. She got married at, 14? Because you had not aged a bit. Anyhow, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. George kind of hijacked a little bit of my question, but with money being such a central driving force on the election, getting into office, and Donald Trump bankrolled his own campaign until he became the nominee and so forth. You've got Yang, you've got Steyer, you have Mike Bloomberg. Is this a blip on the radar, or are we moving away from a traditional public servant who moves into a higher role in the country, or is it just whoever has the most money wins?
That's a fascinating question. I would quibble with the premise a little bit in that I think we overestimate the extent to which money buys elections.
I agree.
In fact, most successful,
Especially
at the presidential level, because there is so much public awareness of the campaigns built through the media and other sources, that it's very hard to get a message out and have that be the only message if you're a candidate. But also the track record of rich people trying to use their money to get elected to office without experience is dismal. Usually they lose. And in fact, Trump spent way less than most of the other Republican candidates in the 2016 primary. He's a very frugal, some would say stingy person. He hates to waste money. His campaign consisted essentially of an airplane and a Twitter account. And he did not have, traditional consultants. He did not buy television ads in the primary. And even in the general election, bought very few television ads and didn't spend a lot of his own money on his campaign. And so that's something that'll be different in 2020. He's going to have all the money he needs. He's raising money, particularly online, like gangbusters, and you have a coordinated Republican Party behind him. But at the same time, he is the first he's the first president since Hoover to not have any background in elected office or the military. So it's still a pretty unusual thing. I'd wait till we have a few more examples to say, oh no, we don't care about experience in elected office anymore.
Thank you. We'll stay on this side. Go ahead, sir.
That's fine. Liz to McPhee. Hi. Okay, perfect. My name is Kevin. I come from Miami-Dade College. I am a journalism major. And you guys seem very well informed on politics and all these things. I know it's a 24/7 job. What do you guys do to shut it off on the weekends? What do you guys do to get your mind off of that? Because if not, you're going to go crazy.
You shut it off?
No,
I think you do.
It's hard to shut off entirely. But no, I do think as a matter of mental health, you do have to escape a little bit. You can go to places with sunshine and beaches. That's a great way to deal with it. I have 3 kids, so on the weekends, most of what I'm doing is spending time with my family and doing the laundry and the grocery shopping, and that has a very soothing, stabilizing effect. And when I read for pleasure, I mostly read fiction. I don't mostly read about politics. So I read a lot about politics for my day job, and my number one tip for anyone who wants to be a journalist is to just read constantly, consume as much journalism as you can, as much information as you can. But yes, at some point, you want to read about something else. You want to, watch a movie that isn't The Handmaid's Tale, because my day job is the dystopia beat. I don't need that when I go home.
Thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
Hi, Austin. I'm a senior at Quinnipiac University. So you guys talked earlier about how America is a center-left, center-right, like center country, but in 2016 we saw the most extreme candidate on stage get elected. Now going into 2020, the top 3 candidates, one's a self-proclaimed democratic socialist, the other's very left-leaning. So do you think that Americans themselves are kind of continuing to diverge and becoming more partisan, or do you think just the candidates that we're choosing to support are more partisan?
Do you think Donald Trump was extreme?
I think he's the most extreme candidate on stage, and I think he is extreme, yes.
Extreme in terms of his ideology, or in terms of his...
In terms of his party, I would say the majority of Republicans were less extreme than he was.
Because I would argue that he's actually a very traditional Republican president in terms of most of his policies, not everything. But if you take Donald Trump's name out of it and maybe inserted Ronald Reagan or George Bush, his policies, especially domestically, conservative judges, tax cuts, are a pretty traditional Republican approach. But you may disagree.
No, I would actually go further than that. I would say that this is backed up by my anecdotal observations, but also by polling. Many voters in 2016 perceived Trump as a moderate because he was not a traditional Republican. In so many ways, he ran against the Republican Party, and he said that he most of the candidates on that stage were saying we need fiscal responsibility, we've got to cut back Medicare and Social Security, and Donald Trump was vowing to protect those benefits and keep the government spending money on those things. A lot of voters heard that. He was taking a line on trade that you would be more likely to hear from Bernie Sanders than a Jeb Bush, saying that, arguing for protectionism, arguing to get rid of the trade deals that most traditional Republicans support. He even said he was in favor of universal health care. Now, he also was against Obamacare, but so I think one thing Trump did was position himself as a sort of a populist in ways that he hasn't necessarily followed through on in office, but that led a lot of voters, particularly in those sort of crucial Rust Belt states, to hear that message that was sort of economically liberal but culturally conservative. And that's a perpetually sort of underserved quadrant of the electorate. But at the same time, another thing that Trump does is he just takes every position on every issue, right? We're going to bomb the crap out of ISIS, but we're also going to take the military away from the rest of the world. So if you are against military entanglements, you hear, oh, this is my guy who doesn't want war. If you're a hawk, you hear, oh, this is my guy who wants to be more aggressive with the military, right? He says he's for universal health care. At the same time, he says he wants to, he's saying the nastiest possible things about Obamacare. So wherever you are on that issue, you can feel like you're hearing that message from him. So because he doesn't feel any need to be consistent, or to sort of stick to one position, I think he enabled a lot of people to hear just messages all across the spectrum. So if you're a far right voter, you could indeed. I heard a lot of people, in the primary when Ted Cruz and others were criticizing Trump, who's a former Democrat, who in the past was for lethal abortion and gun control and all kinds of other liberal things. And so during the primary, you had a lot of the Republicans on that stage criticizing him for not being conservative enough. And I'd go to Trump's events and I'd ask voters about this, and they'd say, no, my definition of conservative is pro-gun, anti-illegal immigration. And so it really depends what your mindset is and also what you think you're hearing from the candidate.
Thank you for the question. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Matteo Pozzi. I come from Harvard Extension School. So my question would be, looking forward to the upcoming campaign, you said that the Democratic field is very large, unusually large. And I was wondering how does this work and how does this affect their campaign strategies? And could it ever work against the Democratic Party in any way? And if so, how?
You mean work against them in what way?
About running to presidency. If it could work against
would it damage the nominee
Yes.
to have this protracted campaign? Possibly. I think that's a really great question, because you do have all of these campaigns trying to figure out their strategy in this unprecedented environment. Nobody knows how. I think in past elections there was a feeling like, okay, well, here's what you do if you want to play in Iowa. Here's the type of campaign you build. Here's the type of strategy you pursue. Here's what you would do if you thought your chances were better in New Hampshire, and so on and so forth. All of these campaigns are sort of flying blind. They don't have really any precedent to figure out, and the electorate's in such a different mood than they were even 4 years ago. So I think it's a fascinating sort of strategic free-for-all, where history's not necessarily a guide. The other part of your question, every time there's a contested primary, you have a lot of hand-wringing from partisans saying, oh no, we shouldn't all be tearing each other down, yelling at each other, that's going to hurt the nominee when it comes to the general election. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. There's still members of the Hillary Clinton Brain Trust who blame Bernie Sanders for damaging her in the eyes of voters and for her losing the election. At the same time, a lot of members of Barack Obama's campaign, although they worried that Hillary didn't drop out until the convention, ended up feeling like because Democrats rallied around Obama in 2008 for the general election, it strengthened him to have that early test and to have to sort of go through the paces against a very, very strong primary candidate so that he was tested and ready for the campaign to come in the fall. And then a lot of political scientists will tell you that none of this actually matters, and that things like the state of the economy and demographics and the public mood and all that are what really determine who wins elections. And all of this campaign strategy is basically just something consultants do to pay themselves a lot of money.
And we've never had a Michael Bloomberg, who is worth $54 billion and will spend whatever it takes trying to get a nomination, not even running as an independent. You get the last question. We're out of time, so go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Gabriela. I go to Suffolk University in Boston. And my question is related to something...
Sorry about the Patriots.
Yeah, I'm not from Boston. So
Oh.
My question is related to something we haven't really mentioned, and it just further proves my point. We have a massive amount of information available from the media regarding to politics in the United States and international relations. But there are a number of territories that the United States own, and 4 of those are inhabited by millions of American citizens because they are born in territories of the United States. Now, do you believe the media has a responsibility to highlight the events that take place in these territories, since these people are American citizens and policy should, also affect them?
Yes, of course. I think, something that happens in Puerto Rico is just as newsworthy as something that happens in Vermont, right? And we are not necessarily out there putting Vermont on the front page every day, but if something happens there, we cover it. And it ends up being very interesting in primaries in particular, right? Because all of those territories have delegates in the primary. And so I believe it was Bloomberg who just set up a campaign office in the U.S. Virgin Islands. You always have candidates who campaign in Puerto Rico and take sides on the statehood issue and so on. So I think the territories actually tend to get much more attention during presidential campaigns than during the normal course of coverage, when probably only are going to hear about them when something terrible happens, unfortunately. But they're absolutely a part of the political process, in part because of that role in the primary.
And with all due respect to Iowa and New Hampshire, I'm a big proponent of having the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico as the first in the nation caucuses and primaries. So I think
totally support that, yes.
So let's conclude where we began. These students are here. This is day 1 of a 2-week seminar. They're going to get a lot of incoming information from a lot of different people. But what questions do you have for the next couple of weeks with regard to Iran, impeachment, and 2020 politics? What should these students be looking out for?
Well, I want to know when and how the Senate impeachment trial is going to start. That's a big unanswered question that I think will probably get answered in the next couple of weeks. I want to know whether and how Iran is going to retaliate for what we've done to them and what kind of chain of events that might set off. And I want to know how the American political establishment is going to handle that debate, and whether we're capable of having a responsible debate about foreign policy in this day and age, given how inflamed everything is, and what shape that's going to take, given that it seems like probably the first thing that the House is going to take up as they come back from vacation this week.
And just think about that split screen. You've got the escalation of tensions in the Middle East, you've got a Senate trial potentially, and you have primaries and caucuses just a few weeks away. I mean, it's an incredible moment in American history.
It is, and you also have, this is minor by comparison perhaps, but it's still an interesting couple of things to note. The president's trade deal revising NAFTA, sailing through both houses of Congress with robust bipartisan majorities, and no shutdown. And that's because the White House, together with both parties in Congress, was able to negotiate a year-long budget deal that everybody could agree on. So some stuff is working here in Washington.
I know we're kind of one last question. The Nancy Pelosi book. One thing that you think surprised you the most, one takeaway in your research without giving away too much, but you're among friends.
Oh wow, there's so much.
We know she's a good cook.
No, actually, she hates to cook.
Oh really?
Yeah,
oh.
She doesn't. She never liked cooking. In fact, her kids grew up eating a lot of takeout, and so one of my favorite Nancy Pelosi stories, I'll tell this one, is that she was a housewife. She graduated college and immediately got married. She had 5 kids in 6 years and moved to San Francisco with her husband and she was a political fundraiser and volunteer, came from a political family in Baltimore where her father was the mayor. But she never expected to run for office herself. And the story she tells about how she got started is the mayor of San Francisco at the time, Joe Aliotto, fellow Italian-American, called her up one day and said, "I've been doing all this volunteer work for the library. I want you to be on the board of library commissioners in San Francisco." And she said, "Oh, Mr. Mayor, that's very sweet of you to say, but I just love my volunteer work, and I don't need to be on the commission. I'm happy to continue to volunteer." And the reason I thought of it is because he called her, and in what she found this sort of chauvinistic. He said, "Nancy, what are you doing? You cooking a big pot of pasta?" She said, "No, Mr. Mayor, I'm reading the newspaper." But when she said, "No, I don't need to be on the board," he lectured her. He said, "Now, don't say that. You're doing the work. You should have the authority. You should have the official position. You should have a say in what's going to happen, not just be this unpaid worker bee." And that was an aha moment in her career, because she realized, particularly as a woman in the 70s, nobody necessarily listened to her when she opened her mouth. But the minute she had a vote, the minute she had actual hard power, authority, even on something like the library board, it changed everything in terms of the way that people listened to her. And so I think her entire career flows from that, where she realized the power that comes from having the votes to do something, whether or not people are willing to take you seriously.
Check out Molly's work at time.com. What a marvelous way to begin your 2 weeks here in Washington. How many are first-time visitors to our nation's capital? And you came to Washington the first time when?
8th grade. But I moved here in 2010.
Okay. How about a round of applause?